All right, thank you so much for tuning in today. Today's video is a Q&A topic based on batteries, solar, inverters, electrical systems, and everything else required to take your sailboat off the grid and stay there for a while. I'm very happy to say that it is sponsored by Battle-Born Batteries. We've had Battle-Born Batteries on Delos for quite a few years now. We've torture tested the heck out of them in real world cruising scenarios, and I can wholeheartedly say that they are an absolute game changer for the type of cruising that we do. The first thing I wanted to do was give a little recap of the equipment that we installed on Delos. So what do we have? If you head on over to svdelos.com/lithium, you'll see a complete list of the gear that we have installed, but I'm going to go ahead and go through it anyway. I'm also going to show a little electrical diagram of Delos' system as we go through this so that it kind of will help you understand what I'm talking about. So really the heart of our system is 8 100 amp hour lithium Battle-Born batteries. That provides a total of 800 amp hours at 12 volts or 400 amp hours at 24 volts. The same amount of energy, it's just measured a little bit differently because amp hours is a very silly rating. I really don't like it. I'm going to get into that a little bit more later. But the heart of the system, 800 amp hours at 12 volt batteries, lithium, that is enough for us. And we have a fairly serious electrical load on Delos. I'm going to describe some of the things that we have a little bit later. Hooked up to the batteries, we have a 3 kVA or 3000 watt Victron inverter charger. We have a total of 800 watts of flexible solar panels and 600 watts of solid solar panels on the arch for a total of 1400 watts. We have 2 different charge controllers to handle that power that feed in and charge the batteries. We have 2 wind generators on the back. Both of them are rated at 400 watts. One of them on the port side we usually leave turned off because it's quite noisy. We call it the anchor sweeper. And if you've ever anchored next to a boat with one of these on, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The other one on our starboard side is the silent wind. It's also rated at 400 watts, has a different blade design. Really love that one. We leave it on all the time and it works great for us. In addition to the renewable sources of solar and wind on board, we also have an 8 kilowatt Onan marine generator. It's a 220 volt 50 cycle generator, and it powers all of our big AC items. Like some stuff consumes a lot of power. For example, our water maker consumes 2,500 watts. It's quite a bit of power. Dive compressor, about the same. Those are big AC motors. When we turn on their air conditioning, that's about 3,500 watts. Battery chargers, we have a lot of. We have about 250 amps at 24 volts. So that can be, I'll have to do the calculation on that. Show it right here. Bing. So once again, if you'd actually like to see the gear with links that we have installed, just head on over to svdelos.com/lithium and we'll show you the actual kit with pricing and all that. And finally, if you'd like to see our installation videos that we did of installing all these things and switching Delos over to induction cooking and totally getting rid of propane, I'll put up a link somewhere, either here or here, and also there in the description. Today's questions were submitted by our patrons, so thank you very much to Delos patrons for sending in the questions and topics for this video. Okay, going to jump right into the first question here. So the first question is from Sarah, and she says, do the solar panels alone handle your electrical needs, or is the generator needed on a regular basis? The answer to that is not straightforward, and the reason is it really depends on where we are, how long we plan to go out cruising, and the weather conditions. And so right now, I'm just gonna give a pretty typical scenario. We are in Mexico, up in the Sea of Cortez. We made our last major port stop about 2 months ago. And what that means is we have an enormous amount of refrigeration on Delos. And so we're actually at this moment running 3 refrigerators and 1 freezer, which is a huge electrical load. At this point in time, we run at a deficit of about 20 to 25% per day, meaning that we generate off of solar power about 5 kilowatt hours of power, but we're consuming somewhere between 6 and 7 kilowatt hours of energy per day. Normally, we'd be able to make up the difference on wind power Just with the silent wind alone, we can normally make about 1 kilowatt hour of power per day. But there's really no wind up here in the Sierra Cortez at all, so we're not getting any power from that. So every day or night when I wake up, we're down about 80 amp hours out of our 400 amp hour bank, which then the next day we're down, another 80, and so we're running at a deficit at this point, only because we are not conserving power. We have a bunch of fridges running, we have a bunch of freezers running. We're running our satellite all the time for internet because we're in the middle of nowhere. And we're running our AC because it is freaking hot, so it really doesn't matter. Under normal circumstances, if we were just going out for a few weeks or something, then Karen wouldn't have one whole refrigerator dedicated to just like yogurt and cheddar cheese, and our electrical load would go down significantly. And in those cases, then we can maybe run the generator about once every week just to run the water maker, do laundry, do a few other tasks like that. So yes, it is definitely possible for us to do, although to do it, we do have to think about conserving energy a little bit, which kind of makes sense, right? So on to the next question here. So Scott Wise asked, I'm wondering how much power do the sails create when Delos is sailing at 6 knots? Would there be a horsepower figure? That's an interesting question. All right, so let's kind of like factor this against our engine, and we can try and come up with a relative horsepower figure. Let's say that we have 15 knots of wind and we're sailing Delos at a reasonable angle of, maybe beam reach or slightly forward of the beam, something that doesn't take it away from apparent wind. Our boat speed under good conditions at 15 knots of wind is going to be somewhere between 7 and 8 knots of boat speed, depending on a number of factors. If we were to make 7.5 knots on the engine, let's say, I would be at about 2,200 RPM. We have a 78 horsepower turbo diesel, and I think that that's somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 60 to 65 horsepower. So this is going to be totally dependent per boat, but my best guess for Delos is that 15 knots of wind equals approximately 60 to maybe 65 horsepower equivalent of a diesel engine. 20-25 knots is going to be significantly more just because the exponential power of the wind on that curve. Okay, here's a question from David Seabrook. He says, what's the fire risk with lithium batteries? Is there some kind of alarm to monitor battery temperature or alert you to problems? Yes, absolutely. So on Delos, we have a number of systems that monitor the batteries. The battle-borne batteries themselves that we're using have a built-in battery management system called a BMS. And the BMS is looking at things like the temperature. If the batteries are too hot, it turns them off. If the batteries are too cold, it prevents them from charging because you can actually damage the batteries that way. If you take the voltage too low or the voltage too high, or you attempt to pull out too much current from any one battery, the BMS protects that. So there is some temperature protection in there. The other thing to mention is that these types of batteries are lithium iron phosphate batteries, which is a different chemistry than you're going to find in a laptop, a car, a mobile phone. It's a much more stable and resilient chemistry. However, it's a slightly more energy, it's slightly less energy dense because of that. So in addition to the built-in battery management system in each battery, we also have an external battery management system that is looking at the temperature of each battery. In fact, our battery chargers have a temperature monitor on them. So if the batteries happen to heat up, they will reduce current to the batteries. We also have that built into our Victron battery voltage monitoring system that tells us like, hey, this is the temperature of the battery bank, this is the temperature of the battery compartment. So it's fairly well watched. We've had the lithiums on board for almost 5 years now, I think, and I've never actually seen them get warm. Actually, they stay way cooler than the old lead acid things we had in there. Okay, Bill Parker asks, regarding batteries and solar, based on the flex panels and the wind turbine, how do they keep the batteries charged? Well, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about kilowatt hours on this, because a lot of people talk about boat stuff in amp hours, and amp hours is tough because amp hours is dependent on the voltage of the system. So amp hours at, like I said before, 800 amp hours at 12 volts equals 400 amp hours at 24 volts. The reason is because power or wattage actually equals current times voltage. And so when I talk about this, I'm going to talk about things in terms of kilowatts and kilowatt hours. And so if you want to figure out how many watts something is, you can just multiply the voltage that it consumes times the current that it produces. And if you then multiply that by time, you get something called kilowatt hours. So for example, your windlass on your sailboat, ours has a 1 kilowatt motor in it. So when I turn it on, it consumes 1,000 watts. At 24 volts, that's about 50 amps. At 12 volts, it would be about 100 amps because the power is the same. If the voltage changes, then the current has to adjust accordingly via Ohm's law. I actually made a whole video on this. It's called What the Hell is an Amp Hour? I'll put the link bing right here and bing in the description if you want to check that out later. It describes this detail in depth, but just to give you an idea of how much power 1 kilowatt hour is, if you were to run our windlass, which is a pretty powerful motor, 1,000 watts for an entire hour, that would be 1 kilowatt hour. Some of you may have a hot water boiler or a tea kettle, like an electric tea kettle at home. Those typically burn about 2,000 watts when you turn it on. And so if you were to run that tea kettle or that electric water boiler for 1 hour, you would burn 2 kilowatt hours of power. I think that's interesting because you can kind of visualize the amount of work that is. It's pretty incredible the amount of work that 1 kilowatt hour of power can do. For example, on our 1,400 watts of solar in good conditions, we're talking in the tropics, clear skies during the summer, long days, we're producing about on average 5 kilowatt hours of power per day. And if it's blowing around 15 knots on average, we're going to get another kilowatt hour another 1 kilowatt hour of power per day from wind. That's only from one wind generator, because we do leave the one on the port side off most of the time because it's just too noisy. So let's say that we're in normal conditions and we're generating 6 kilowatt hours of power per day. Our total battery bank would be 400 amp hours times 24 volts. Let me just do the exact calculation here. Okay, so our battery bank is the equivalent of 9.6 kilowatt hours per day. So if we run that battery bank down, we can top it up, assuming that we don't use anything else. We're reaching almost 2/3 of the capacity generated per day based on 1,400 watts of solar. What that actually means is I have an interesting number here. So if you take the total that we produce on solar and you divide it by the number of watts, so if we divide 5 kilowatt hours of power per day divided by 1,400 watts of solar, we get an average of 3.5 watt hours per watt of rated panel. So, let's say that you have a 100 watt panel, multiply that by 3.5, and that's the average that we found in actual energy produced over time that you will get. I compared that with a couple other boats in the anchorage. The lowest we saw was 3.2 and the highest we saw was 5.1. The differences there are going to be a number of things. It could be the efficiency of the panels, the newness of the panels, whether the panels are clean or not, where do you have them installed. For example, our flex panels on the back of Delos, they get shaded. They get shaded from the satellite dome, they get shaded from the mizzen mast, they get shaded from the wind generators on either side. The ones on our deck get shaded by, the mizzen boom, the main boom, the standing rigging, everything else. So it's going to vary widely. If you have your panels like completely open where there's no shading, you're going to get a little bit higher number. But 3.5 I think is a pretty average number. That's good weather, good conditions. If there are any clear skies or you're doing higher latitude sailing out of the tropics, that number is just going to go down. But at least it should, I think, give you a good idea of the amount of energy that can be produced per watt of rated panel. So the next part of Bill's question, is the wind turbine an effective source? I think it is. I think I love it. It just, you know, in 50 knots of wind, it just sits there and cranks in power. For us, it's always putting in about 60 or 70 watts, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, but on average, we're getting 1 kilowatt hour per day. It doesn't take up a huge footprint of space. So if you can do it and you think you're going to be somewhere where there are trade winds, it definitely works. The other cool thing about it is where the solar is only putting in power while the sun is out, the wind generator is putting in power all the time. And so overnight, it can really help you with your overnight deficit. If you have wind, it's constantly pumping in, you know, 60 or 70 knots is enough to run a fridge for sure. So from that aspect, if you don't have a lot of battery capacity, I think it could be very helpful. Next part of Bill's question, do you have your inverter turned on all the time or only when you need 110 volt power? Can you run your AC regularly? Yeah, so when we first started sailing, I would only turn our inverter on when we needed it, because it does use power. You know, every little adapter that you have plugged into an outlet that you touch and is warm is consuming power. You know, even some appliances when plugged in are consuming power. So if you have your inverter on and you have a bunch of stuff turned on, it's going to consume some power. For us, because we use so much power, we actually don't even care. We have a 220 volt, 50 hertz, 3 kilowatt inverter. It's not huge, but it's big enough for us. We basically leave it on almost all of the time. I recently just started turning it off at night. I mean, for the last couple months, we just had it on all the time. I wanted to see what a difference it would make for us if I did turn it off overnight. You know, we're such an electric boat on Delos. We have electric toilets, we have electric water pumps, you know, electric sails, electric furling, everything on this boat is electric. We're running the satellite all the time, and so we have a huge power demand. Like I said, you know, 3 fridges, 1 freezer, ice machine, you know, everything's just going on. When we are running our stuff overnight and I leave the inverter on, we're consuming about 110 amp hours per night. Let me give that in kilowatt hours. Consuming about 2.6 kilowatt hours, or just over a quarter of our battery bank, with the inverter left on 24 hours a day, even overnight and everything. And when I turn it off overnight, we consume 80 amp hours, which is the equivalent of 1.9, let's just round it up to 2 kilowatt hours of power per night. And, you know, that's maybe turning it off at like 10 or 11 or whenever I go to bed, and then turning it on at like, you know, 7 or 8 or whenever we happen to wake up on average. So turning it off does definitely save power if that's what you need to do. Okay, can you run your air conditioning regularly? Yes, we can, but only because we run our generator. So each of our air conditioning units is 8,000 BTUs. Meaning that each one consumes somewhere between 800 and 900 watts. If you put all 3 of them together plus the cooling circulation pump, you're probably talking about, what is it, 3,500 to 3,600 watts. So for every hour that we run our air conditioning, we consume, let's just say, 3.5 kilowatt hours of power. Remember, we have a 9.6 kilowatt hour bank. So every hour that we run our air conditioning would consume 35% of our entire battery capacity. So for me, given that we normally run on a slight power deficit when we're not saving, to use that much for air conditioning on a routine basis off the batteries doesn't make sense, because I would just have to run the generator anyway to replenish the charge. The same goes for the water maker, the same goes for the dive compressor. Yes, we could run them off the batteries, but at some point I still need to find a way to put that power back in. So for us, turning on the generator and running it for, you know, 2-3 hours, it uses 2 liters of fuel per hour, which is not a lot. We can get everything done that we need since it's an 8 kilowatt generator. It's really, I think, an efficient use. And then the rest of the time when we don't have the generator off, we're just running off solar batteries, and it really works. It works pretty well for us. So if you look in the owner's manual for Delos, and she's a year 2000 boat, produced really before people had a lot of solar and alternative energy on board. The owner's manual recommends that you run the generator for about 4 hours per day, 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon. And given the addition of solar energy, we can skip 2 or 3 days, and then I would need to run it for, you know, probably 1.5 hours per day that we skip. So I think we have about an hour to an hour and a half generator running deficit based on our current consumption. All right, I hope that answers your question about the air conditioning. Maybe if you have more solar and a less ongoing electrical intensive load, it's definitely possible, I think. You know, the other thing is we are not a very typical boat, because right now I can tell you that there are 3 laptops on, the satellite's on, our network attached storage is on, Sierra's probably watching a cartoon, we're making ice, and we have all this stuff running. And so by no means is our electrical consumption on Delos like what I would consider to be standard, typical. It's much, much, much more. Okay, next question. This one is from John Friedberg, and he asks, when do you start worrying about the battery charge level, and what immediate steps do you take to conserve energy? Great question, John. So typically when we had the lead acid batteries, whether they be AGM or standard lead or gels or whatever, the rule was don't take them below 60 or 70%. In doing that, you would kind of like prolong the life of the battery. Deeper discharge on lead seriously affects the number of cycles that you can recharge. Lithium is a completely different ballgame. So on ours, I routinely take ours down to, 25%, 20%, even 10%, so 90% depth discharge in some cases. According to Battleborn, the manufacturer, they say that this does not affect the life of the batteries, and you still get an incredibly long lifespan. In this case, Battleborn actually backs it up with a 10-year warranty. So yeah, it's actually pretty cool, and it just gives you so much more usable battery capacity. I always like to think, like, what if you had a car that had a fuel tank, and if you took the fuel tank below, let's say 60%, it would damage your engine on your car. Pretty ridiculous, right? Yeah, so once you go lithium, you won't have to worry about that anymore. Next question, John Frodkin asks, when a boat that is already set up as a pretty serious cruising yacht makes the jump to lithium batteries, what needs to be changed with regards to the charging system? In my case, I carry 4 8D gel cells and have a smart regulator and a 200 amp alternator. Would the voltage regulator need to be replaced? And if so, what do you recommend? Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and pop up a link to our installation video over here so that you can take a look at that. But the short term is because all of our equipment on board was relatively new. In other words, purchased within the last few years. Some of the stuff is like 5 and 6 years old, so not totally new, but kind of new. Pretty much almost everything worked. And the key things to think about is, can you match the voltage requirements for the lithium charging curve? So basically, when you get a newer solar charge controller, wind charge controller, or battery charger, it's gonna have an option for lithium batteries. And what you're doing there is you're setting the bulk charge, the saturation charge, and the float charge. And in this case, what you basically want lithium to do is basically charge, and then shut off. For our Battleborn batteries, that voltage is 29.2 volts, fairly high. On a 24 volt system, it is 14.6 volts on a 12 volt system. So if your whatever charge controllers you have for whatever you want to do with them, if you can set them to match that 14.6 on a 12 volt system and then shut off and then go to float at 27.2, then it should be compatible. So actually we didn't end up replacing any of our battery chargers or any of our charge controllers when we made the switch. The one thing you really do need to think about is what happens if you're charging, whether from the alternator or from something else like a battery charger or solar, and the lithiums disconnect because of a problem. That could potentially cause a voltage spike in the system, which could actually damage some components. We installed a Sterling voltage spike suppressor. I don't know if they still make it. I'm gonna go ahead and put some B-roll of what the unit looks up right now. If they still sell those, I think that might be certainly worth thinking about. As regards to the alternator, You know, we actually don't really depend on our alternator so much. That's one thing that I didn't modify. It's just a standard alternator. It's very small. It's 35 amps. We only use it when we're motoring. We never really use it to charge the house bank because we have, you know, solar, wind, generator that is much more efficient at charging. The problem there is the lead batteries charge at a lower voltage, usually in like the 27 range for us, or 13 point something range on a 12-volt system. And so what that means, if you don't update your regulator on your alternator to one that supports a lithium curve, and if you have an internal regulator, it probably doesn't support voltage that high, then you will never fully charge the lithium batteries. It will kind of trickle charge in, but you'll never really fully top them up. For us, not an issue, because if we motor, you know, we're motoring long distances, 10, 14, 20 hours, whatever the case may be, and then it's just fine. You know, with the solar and the wind, it doesn't really matter. Okay, Tim S. What size alternator do you currently have on your engine, and have you thought about going to a super high output one? I'm just finishing my lithium upgrade project. I don't have a generator and decided to put in a 250 amp alternator. I have to make hot water that way anyway, but curious of your thoughts. Yeah, I understand the hot water deal. You know, for us, like I just mentioned, we used to have a 50 amp alternator. When that one was 20 years old, when it went out, I couldn't get a matching 50 amps, so I ended up installing a 35 amp alternator. For us, because we don't really care about using the main engine to charge the house bank, it works just fine for us. Doesn't even have an external regulator, just the internal regulator, and it's worked just fine. But then again, we have lots of solar, we have lots of wind, and we can fall back on the generator if we need to. If you do not have a generator, then, you know, I think a string of cloudy days could really wreck your situation if you're depending on solar solely. And so a high output alternator on your main engine that you can just run to top them off if needed might actually be a pretty good idea. Mark Hubbard asks, is a power audit worth doing? Yes, absolutely. So, you know, on Delos, we know how much power we're getting in from solar. We know how much power we're getting in from wind, and I can look on the power meter and see how much power is being consumed from the boat. And so if there's a mismatch there, or you're using more than you think you should, then isolating it further is definitely worthwhile. And so what you can do is actually figure out exactly how much power each thing is consuming. You know, we have electric toilets, those consume some power. Each fridge consumes some power. In our case, it's BD35 compressors. They consume about 60 to 70 watts when they're on. I think I actually remember making a video about that. I will go ahead and pop that link up here so that you can refer to that. We go through and we see how much power we actually consume regularly cruising on Delos, and what each thing takes in amp hours and watt hours. So that might be interesting for you to check out. So another question from Mark Hubbard. Do you do much in the way of plotting positions, or are you mainly electric charts now? So we have been fully electric charts for a while, since leaving Seattle. We do carry some large scale ocean style charts. We do keep some logs of our positions just in case. You know, we do have a bunch of redundant systems, 2 antennas on the main navigation system. We have a portable GPS, we have our phones, we have our laptops, and all of that is capable of navigating. If we had a massive power failure for one reason or another, or struck by lightning, and everything goes dark, we do have a sextant, and we can refer back to like our logs that we do at the change of each watch. And so then we can say like, hey, we were here, the sextant says we're now here, we need to continue in this direction towards our next port. So I think that's cool to know. In fact, I think that Admiralty even stopped making or printing paper charts. Is that correct? I heard that. Or is that a rumor? Does anybody know? Let me know. Okay, Bob Calvary asks, we are looking to upgrade our boat. It's a Beneteau 28 next year to be able to do some more extended cruising. Hopefully the new boat will come ready equipped with solar. We'll be buying it used. Okay, good choice. But as a near total newbie to marine solar, where does one start to learn the basics? Basic components, system sizing, capacity evaluation, and a zillion questions I don't know to ask yet. Is there a particular information source, 2 or 3, you recommend to get started? Well, I think you have to start out determining the type of cruising you're going to be doing. Are you going to be going long distance ocean crossing to where you need to be self-sufficient for 2 or 3 months at a time? Are you going to be going out for the weekends? Are you doing coastal hops where you can get provisions regularly? These things affect it a lot. For example, refrigeration is usually people's biggest draw. So, if you have a refrigerator running, that's going to consume quite a bit of power. If you have electrical toilets, maybe on a 30-foot boat, you will not have electrical toilets. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and refer you to a video that we made about our solar system. I'll put the link right here. Check that out. And if you have any other questions, just send them to me on Patreon, and I can kind of try and help you a little bit because I think it's a cool topic. Sherry Lundell asks, hi Brian, we are hearing that you can mix lithium batteries with lead acid batteries to help with nighttime discharges. We'd appreciate your opinion on this. Thank you, Sherry and Greg SV Sapphire. I would not mix 2 different battery types on the same charging system or any system. I would not mix 2 different or aged lithium batteries together. The voltages are very different and very specific. I think you might have gotten some misinformation there about that. I think that if you're worried about nighttime discharges, then you would either increase, you would need to increase your capacity to make sure that you didn't bring the batteries too low overnight. But in general, I think it's recommended to not mix different battery types. Dennis Barnes asks, does Brian have a way to track how much energy they generate over time for each capture method for solar, wind, and regen? Because we use some of the smart solar controllers from Victron, I can actually look in and I can see the amount of power produced from the solid panels on the back, the amount of power produced from the flex panels on the deck, and then I can go into the battery voltage monitor and I can see how much power in our state of charge there. So all that monitoring is cool. I can do the same thing for our wind as well. So yes, definitely possible. John Rowlandson asks, are you able to make water on the lithium batteries, or do you still need to run the generator to do that? Well, our water maker is quite big. It makes about 180 liters per hour. It consumes about 2.5 kilowatt hours when it is running. The main thing about being able to run it off the inverter would be the locked rotor current, or the LRC, which on a motor that size can be up to 700 amps. And the inverter just really, really struggles at providing that initial boost of current to get the motor spinning. Once it actually starts spinning, it's a whole different ball game. Then it could run it no problem. That's why on air conditioning systems that are meant to run off of inverters, they sell this thing called a soft start, which actually provides that initial boost of current to help get the rotor spinning, and then the power comes back to normal. So that's one thing that makes it difficult. The other thing is just the total amount of power consumed. So if it's consuming 2.5 kilowatts and I run it for 1 hour to make 180 liters of water, that's 2.5 kilowatt hours of power. I've just burned 50% of the entire solar power that we've made for the day. And so for me, I would just flip on the generator, I would run it for 2 hours, and I would be done for a week or something like that. That's what I would probably do. How much more solar would you need to go 100% electric? No generator, no engine for propulsion. Wow. My first gut instinct is a lot, but being an engineer, let's actually run the math on this, because I think it is a very interesting question. The first thing to keep in mind here is the typical kilowatt rating for an electric motor is 1/2 of the recommended horsepower. So Delos has a 78 horsepower engine. Let's just round it up to 80 to be easy. If I were to do an electric replacement for that, it would be a 40 kilowatt motor would be recommended. I have the spec sheet up for a 40 kilowatt marine electric motor here. It's 40 kilowatt, it weighs 192 kilos, so it's pretty heavy. Equivalent horsepower says 80 to 100, so that's right within the range, and the boat range is 20 to 27 tons. Delos's net weight is like 25 tons, so it's right in there. Let's go ahead and take a look at the curve here and see. So according to this information, it says at 6 knots, we're going to be burning about 11 kilowatts of power. At 7 knots, we're going to be burning about 18 kilowatts of power, which means that even at a slow speed of 6 knots, to move Delos 6 nautical miles, we're going to be burning 200% of the entire energy that we create via solar on Delos in a 24-hour period. So when I think about that, I have a few requirements. And one of my requirements is to be able to motor Delos at a reasonable speed for a 24-hour period. So there's a couple of reasons for that range requirement. First of all, what if you want to go through the Panama Canal? You're not allowed to sail in the Panama Canal. You need to be able to motor for 60 miles, and you probably want some buffer on each end. For example, when we went through, we had to do loops for about 4 hours waiting for our turn. Let's say you want to go up a river in Borneo. You know, we went 150 miles up the Kinabatangan River. That was freaking amazing. I love doing stuff like that. We've seen, you know, windless periods in Southeast Asia, in the Malacca Straits, in, you know, Madagascar and the Mozambique Channel. There's just all these scenarios where I think having at least, at a very minimum, 100 to 150 mile range under power without worrying about it, without having to recharge, is a necessity for me. Cruising personally, and also for safety. You know, let's say that there's some bad weather coming. It just happened to us with the hurricane coming, the calm before the storm. We went across to the other side of the Sea of Cortez. We saw 35 knots, whereas the people who stayed saw wind speeds in excess of 70 knots. So being able to move yourself even 100 miles out of the way can make a huge difference. This is another interesting part of that. This is based on a battery capacity of 20 to 40 kilowatt hours of lithium ion. So keep in mind that our 8 100 amp hour batteries are the equivalent of 9.6 kilowatt hours. So this quote is thinking that you have at least 16 to 32 100 amp hour lithium ion batteries, which is a pretty substantial amount. I'm looking at this graph right here, and it has given me different ranges versus speed for different battery capacities. So for 10 kilowatt hours of batteries at a speed of 3 knots or just over 3 knots, it's saying that my range is 15 nautical miles. At 3 knots, with a 30 kilowatt hour battery bank, 3 times what we have now, my range is about 45 miles. And so for it to be practical for me, either the battery storage capacity needs to improve dramatically, like by a factor of probably 3 or 4 perhaps, or the charging efficiency has to improve by a factor of like a lot. I think the bottom line is that electric propulsion requires an incredible amount of power, like significantly more than running the household items on a boat. And because of that, if you want any type of decent range for long distance cruising, the only really viable way to do it is with a hybrid system, meaning that you have to then still burn diesel fuel to either create electricity to recharge the batteries or burn diesel fuel and turn it directly into mechanical propulsion. And my argument is a sailboat is already hybrid. You have the sails that drive the boat, you have the engine that powers the boat when you can't sail. You're adding complexity to the system. And so right now, unless you can greatly improve the battery capacity or the charging efficiency, it makes sense just to sail, have a diesel engine, get the range you want, not add complexity to the system. So back to the power situation, how much solar would actually be needed to be able to effectively motor that much? To answer this question, I needed to do a few calculations. First, let's assume we have ideal conditions. For example, sunny and clear skies somewhere in the tropics. Then we can use our solar watt-hour factor of 3.5 watt-hours per watt of rated panel per day.
Next, let's assume our goal is to maintain 6 knots for a 24-hour period, giving us a range of about 150 nautical miles, which is pretty reasonable. Finally, we'll assume we're sailing in a displacement hull weighing about 25 tons and specified to use an 80 horsepower or equivalent diesel engine under normal circumstances. At 6 knots, we would use approximately 10 kilowatts of power. If we do this for an hour, we would use 10 kilowatt hours of power, or 2 times the complete daily solar production of Delos, to cover 6 nautical miles. To motor for a full 24 hours would take 240 kilowatt hours of power. If we divide 240 kilowatt hours by our current daily production of 5 kilowatt hours based on 1,400 watts of panels, we need about 50 times the current amount of panels that we have, or about 70 kilowatts of panels. Add to this the fact that we would need a minimum of 150 kilowatt hours of batteries to run through the night, and most likely more, which is about 15 times what we currently have on Delos, or about 120 standard 100 amp hour lithium batteries. The numbers quickly scale out of control. Of course, depending on the type of boat, weight, and a lot of other variables, this will vary greatly. But I think the point is that even catamarans with large surface areas on the roof struggle to accommodate more than 3 kilowatts of panels, which is only 1/23 of what we really need. So for any sort of reasonable range, other than just getting off the dock or the mooring and then charging up again or sitting for days on end, I don't think it's a realistic option for a normal cruising boat unless you use a hybrid diesel option, at which point I would argue you're adding complexity and cost to a sailboat that's already a hybrid to begin with.
Next question from JB Hogan. Is the inductive stovetop a big benefit over the gas one? Know that you have lots of experience with reliability and energy. Okay, so yeah, I am a huge fan of the induction cooking for a couple of reasons. Number one, it allowed us to get propane off the boat. Propane is a heavier than air explosive gas. I feel that it's dangerous. As we were cruising through certain ports, it's difficult to fill. There's always different types of regulators, and some people won't fill your bottles. They'll force you to get their bottles, and they're always too big and oversized. And I always found that I was chasing propane, especially for some longer trips, like when we crossed the Indian Ocean. And so when we went to induction, we were able to get rid of that. We removed our dependency on that, but it's at the cost of power. So on our 24 volt system, we consume about 60 amp hours. It's about 1.5 kilowatt hour. It's about 1.5 kilowatt hours of power per day. It's about 20 to maybe 23% of our total energy budget. So it's significant, but you're putting less heat into the cabin. It's very accurate. It's very efficient cooking, and I really enjoy it. So I think the trade-off is worth it. Okay, so next question from Dan Meir. How important is it to have the same exact impedance to every battery? It's my understanding with batteries that deliver such high amperage that you need to try to make sure that the bus bars are of equal length and the load is distributed across the bus bars. Is any of this true in practicality? Yes, absolutely. If you're dealing with high current, even a slight variation in voltage, 1/10 of a volt, a 1/20 of a volt, can make a huge difference in power because the two are multiplied together. So, in a laid out Delos system, we have two 12-volt batteries in series to make 24 volts, and then we have 4 of those in parallel to get our full 400 amps, or two batteries in series, and then 4 of those give us our 8 batteries. I made sure that they were all equally spaced, that all the wire lengths were the same, and that all the connections were the same type, and then they all came together with equal wire lengths to a common big bus, and then they go and feed the system. If you don't do it that way, you will probably get small, minute voltage differences that in the end will mean that one battery gets a little bit more charge than the other one. The other one might be putting out more current, and I think over time they could eventually become unbalanced, and it could affect the lifespan of the battery. Okay, Matthew Corwell. I have both a lithium house bank as well as a high cold cranking amp lithium starter battery. In most systems with lithium, the starter battery is lead acid, and that protects the alternator when the house bank BMS shuts off. The voltage spike goes to the starter, and the alternator doesn't burn out.
how does Brian think I should be making sure that my alternator is protected in this situation? I think I mentioned this before, but Sterling, I think they still make it. I hope they do. They do make a voltage spike suppressor. I don't know if it's ever worked because I don't think our batteries have ever shut off, but I think it's worth investigating. B-roll should be up right now. Maybe investigate that and take a look. Okay, Lars Torns asks, what do you think about electronics in a 15-foot sailboat used for day sailing areas in the North Sea with very light weather? You know, I would recommend taking a look at some of the B&G stuff, and particularly their Bluetooth masthead wind unit. You know, the things that I care about are wind speed, wind direction, and speed over ground. Speed through the water is also nice that you can judge current. If you get those things, then you can pretty much, I mean, I think that's really what you need. In a small boat like that, you know, maybe not running wires is such a great thing. And so having a Bluetooth masthead unit or a wireless masthead unit might be worthwhile to look into for you. Andrew Duheim, we're on the cusp of fitting out a Lagoon 380 with lithium and solar. She will also be without a diesel generator of any sort. We need significantly less power than you because we're doing propane cooking, low draw DC aircon, and water making. But in this use case, what secondary charging method would you add to the system? Currently, we have two 125 amp engine mounted alternators with internal regulators. Well, I think one thing that you could do, you already have two 125 amp engine mounted alternators. Maybe think about going to an external regulator. You're probably going to get a pretty big boost from that. I would also really think about adding wind. You know, you don't think it produces a lot of power, but it produces consistent power over time. For us, 1 kilowatt hour per day, which is about 20% of what we produce over solar with 1400 watts of panels. So I'm assuming you're going to have lithium and solar. Also, I don't know, low draw DC aircon. You know, the thing about that is what you're doing is you're converting electrical energy to basically pump heat away. And just because it uses DC, I don't think it necessarily means that it uses less power to cool the air. It's just using more current and lower voltage. You're able to run it directly off the batteries and not have to run the inverter. So maybe keep that in mind when you're doing your power budget calculations. Okay, so I just wanted to thank everybody for watching, and especially our patrons for submitting the questions, and Battleborn for sponsoring this video. That's it. I did have a lot more questions, but I'm running short on time, and if you can't tell, I'm literally dripping in sweat because it is hot. I'm gonna go take a little cold water break, put this video together, and see you all on the next one. All right, thanks very much. Have a good one. Ciao.